Hello, hello. It is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me. Today we are doing a live stream all about limiting. And I've got some audio show and tell for you because I have an interest in telling you not only how I use limiters and how I choose limiter settings and mastering, but also I want to allow you to hear this stuff. And we're going to compare different limiters and different limiter modes together. This one is going to be both conceptual. I think you can take away some principles from this, regardless of what limiters you end up using in mixing or mastering. And we're also going to dive deep under the hood of a new tool that's come out just within the past month, Waves, who had the undisputed king of limiters for years. The Waves L2 was like the major limiter you heard in so many major releases for decades. They've now come out with the L4, which is aiming to be the new king of limiters. And it's bringing so many features that new limiters have had with some of the kind of tone that Waves have had in the past. And they have some new tones under the hood. And yes, limiters can have different tones, and we'll explore that together. I want to give a shout out before we get into it to Waves for being sponsors for MixCon. One of the reasons I'm showing their limiters is because they just sponsored a masterclass that happened yesterday. It's been one of the most popular masterclasses of MixCon this year with a guy named Preston Prizzy Reed. If you haven't checked out his masterclass, you've absolutely got to. Totally free to the public, thanks to our sponsors. And Prizzy, he's worked with Kanye West, Usher, Summer Walker, 21 Savage, John Legend, and so many more. And his masterclass was super well received. He took us under the hood of a R&B track, did great work, and did a full-length interview with us as well. We're also giving away more than $10,000 worth of free gear thanks to the MixCon sponsors, including Waves, including a whole bunch of Waves plugins. So definitely check those guys out. Definitely check out MixCon if you haven't. And if you want to play along at home and hear some of these sounds for yourself, go over to waves.com where you can download a free trial of their L4 Ultra Maximizer, as well as their older limiters, which I think still have some value and use today. And we'll talk about that and how this compares to some of the other limiters on the market today, as well as my principles for selecting limiters for mastering and or mixing. All right, without further ado, let's get right into it. Before I go into the features and what's new in the L4 Ultra Maximizer, which I think everything they added here are exactly the things they should have added. And they're exactly the things that were missing from the L2 for modern music production. Before I get into that, I just want to give you my principles and then we'll hear some stuff. When it comes to limiters in mastering or on the end of a mix bus chain, my thing, especially in a mastering context, is the limiter is actually the very first tool that I put on and the very first tool where I select and make specific changes around tone when it comes to mastering. Yes, one of the biggest things I do when it comes to mastering is to grab the limiter that I want and make my best guess about what limiter is going to best suit the material, and then we tweak from there. So one of the first things I say to myself when I'm listening to a track is, in which direction does this track want to go? And there's really only 4 directions that any track can go. And this counts too if you're just EQing individual tracks or a subgroup or mastering entire mix. There's only 4 cardinal directions a mix can go in tonally when it comes to kind of like EQ curve. A mix can get brighter, a mix can get darker, a mix can get more scooped and hyped up, or a mix can get more mid-rangey. And those are some of the initial bits of character I'm looking for in a limiter. And there are certain limiters I've just heard again and again and tested limiter after limiter against each other. And some limiters and limiter modes sound smooth and fat. So if I get a mix that sounds a little bit brighter and tighter than it wants to end up, the very first thing I do is select a limiter that is kind of smoothening and fattening. And then there are other limiters that sound a little bit more bright and aggressive. And if I have a mix that sounds a little bit too fat and it wants to get tightened up and it wants a little bit more teeth on it, then I select, my first thing is a limiter that sounds a little bit tighter and maybe a little bit more aggressive. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about when it comes to limiters. And these are the kinds of things that I'm listening for when I'm getting to know my limiters. Now, good thing with a limiter like the L4 is it now has multiple modes that allow you to select which kinds of tones you want, like right out of the gate. So the default one in here, modern, I would say that this sounds, it's a little bit tighter sounding than, say, the Ozone modern Type 4 limiter, and maybe a little bit tighter sounding than the L2 in ways, but it's both tighter and smoother than the L2 at once, if that's possible. But then for tracks where this has a little bit too much bite and a little bit too much aggression, going to the smooth setting here. Man, this is absolutely smoother to my ear than the L2 and than the isotope ozone in its type 4 setting, just as one basis of comparison, another popular limiter that has multiple modes. And then the aggressive setting, this one has a little bit more teeth. Maybe we hear a little bit more harmonic distortion out of it, which can potentially be what we want. And then there's this safe mode. And the safe mode is meant to have less distortion, but there's always this trade-off with limiters between distortion artifacts and kind of pumping and breathing artifacts. And I would say that out of all of these modes, the aggressive maybe gives us slightly more distortion, but potentially slightly more loudness and excitement. Whereas the safe mode is maybe giving us the least distortion. But when we have low distortion limiters and we do a lot of limiting with them, there's maybe a little bit more where we hear the dynamics processing aspect of the limiter. And then there is the classic L2 mode. So if you wanted the original L2 sound, you can just get the L4 Ultra Maximizer, and it's got the original L2 algorithm built into it. So one of my favorite things that they've added in the Waves L4 is that there's now mode selections, and they basically got all the stuff that I want out of a limiter. We can have a balanced limiter, which is their modern mode, smooth, which is kind of like a fattening limiter, and aggressive, which is maybe more of a exciting and hyping up limiter. There's also this safe mode for lower distortion, and there's an emulation of the classic L2. And we'll compare these different modes to each other, and we'll compare the sound of this to older versions of the Waves limiter. So you can start to listen along with me and start to develop your own sense memory for how limiters can sound different from one another. When we get into the audio examples, I definitely want you to be on good speakers or good headphones because the differences between limiters are subtle. I say it's the first thing that I select for a mastering session, but I don't expect it to do most of the heavy lifting in tone. The biggest thing that I want to do when I'm doing mastering is I first want to get the track up to an appropriate level compared to other tracks in its genre. And this is not only for loudness, but also for density. Because the sound of limiting and the sound of compression is just part of the sound of modern music production. And if you don't have enough limiting or compression on your record for its style, it can sound a little bit out of place. People talk about the problems with sound quality that come from over-limiting and over-compressing, and sure, that is definitely absolutely possible. But you can also have detriment to your sound quality by not limiting enough, and by not compressing enough, and by not making things sound genre appropriate when it comes to density and dynamic control. There are honestly some mixing sins which are forgiven by limiters. Every once in a while, I'll get a mix from somebody and I'm like, this is sounding good, but if you really want notes on, if I had to give you notes, this element is poking out a little bit here, and then the sides sound like the transients are poking a little bit out more than the center, and there could be a little bit more of a smoothing going from this section to the next section, and I feel like I'm either hearing too much lift or not enough lift, and then you go on and you just put on like 2 dB more of limiting, and all of those complaints go away. It's not to say that limiting is a panacea, and that's going to fix all of your mix problems. But there are some issues that you will hear in a mix that just come from it not being limited as much as other records in its style. And you add a couple dB of limiting and it's like, oh, that feels like cheating. But I guess I should just apply as much dynamic range control as are on other records in my style. So that's a big thing to recognize. All right, so those are some of my core principles when it comes to selecting limiters in a mastering context. And the same things go for a mixing context too, because sometimes you want a track to come up in level without dramatically reshaping its attack and release profile. Or you want a track to come up in level and you want to control transients. And in both of those situations, instead of going for the sound of compression, going for the sound of limiting can be potentially more appropriate. And a lot of modern records have things like limiters on vocal tracks and on vocal buses and on parallel drum and snare tracks. So here again, same principles apply. Does the sound need to go fatter? Does it need to go tighter? Does it want more bite? Does it want to sound smoother? I'm first selecting based on the direction I think the sound needs to go, the sound that that limiter has when it's doing lots of limiting, and you can only get to know each one by actually hearing them doing way too much limiting. And then getting an appropriate level, and then making my EQ decisions, usually into the limiter. So let's go over a few more of the controls that make the L4 Ultra Maximizer new, interesting, useful, and then we'll compare it to some other older versions of limiters, and we'll compare different tones. So the biggest thing that these guys have added on for this is this mode selection, which we've talked about, super important to me. This release timing, I believe, was available on the L2, so you can set the release to be even faster or even slower. If you want to be even smoother, you might set it slower. If you want to be even more aggressive, you might set it even faster. There's now clipping built into this limiter as well. We have a soft clipper. So this is something where sometimes adding a little bit of harmonic distortion by using a clipper, which is basically a super, super fast limiter. A clipper is basically a dynamic control device that has an instantaneous attack and release, where if something's above the threshold, it gets affected. If something below the threshold, it doesn't get affected, and the timing of that signal makes no difference. That's a clipper. A limiter is a little bit different, where it takes into consideration a little bit of the timing of the element, as well as potentially, if it's a compressor, how far it is above the threshold might affect how much it's getting limited. There's also this stereo link control that's been added. And I think this is huge. This is super important. And I think not having the stereo link control is one of those things that has made in recent years the L2s start to lose a little bit of its market share. Stereo link control is a big thing for me, especially in mastering applications. I almost never do 100% stereo linking on the mastering sessions that I do. There's some exceptions to that. In general, for me, when we have completely linked left and right controls, or left and right dynamics, like threshold sensing, the mix tends to sound a little bit smoother and a little bit narrower. But the more that we get unlinked, the more that the left and right get limited independently, the more that the mix sounds a little bit wider, and the more that it kind of potentially jumps out at you. I find just backing off a little bit, somewhere between often 70% and 80%, somewhere in this range, maybe as high as 90%, 70 to 90, in here is where I often, by ear, find myself setting my stereo link controls in mastering. Every once in a rare while, when we come to artists who are doing like 1960s style, like super weird hard panning, then I might unlink the controls even more substantially still. And every once in a while, if things are a little bit too erratic and the sides are poking out too much and things need to be restrained in the sides and smoothed out a little bit, I'll keep it up there around the 100%. But I find backing off here often gives us a little bit more excitement and a little bit more width. Other controls that they've added in here that I think are supremely interesting is this now upward compressor. So there's an upward compressor in the L4 Ultra Maximizer. This is something that an influential mastering engineer named Bob Katz was a big advocate for with his book. Was it The Art of Mastering? Is that what it was called? Someone tell me in the comments if they know the name of Bob Katz's book. I've definitely had both editions of it. They're here somewhere in the office, but he was big on upward compression before like anyone ever used an upward compressor and before there were actual upward compressors to be used. So I feel like he was beating the drum for them somewhat speculatively, but they are cool. The difference between a limiter and an upward compressor is a limiter takes our loudest signals and turns them down so that we can take our new shortened dynamic range and bring it up. So a limiter does this. We got our dynamic range, our lowest level signal and our highest level signal. The limiter takes the highest level signals and turns them down so we can turn the whole thing up. And that has the effect of softening transients and smearing transients. That can potentially be bad if you overdo it because it can suck the life out of a record. But it can potentially be really, really, really good as well if we want to have the sound of more controlled transients, which is sometimes useful. An upward compressor does the exact opposite of this. Instead of taking our loudest sounds and turning them down, we just take sounds below a threshold and turn them up. And that is what the upward compressor here on the L4 Ultra Maximizer is doing. And it has a distinctly different sound to me than just limiting the top. Couple other cool features that have been added in to the L4 relative to the L2 is they've added in this gain match control. So we can hear the effect our limiter is having without the volume fluctuation of increased limiting. So we can hear if we're just being fooled by loudness or if we actually like the sound of the additional limiting. There's also this delta function, so we can hear exactly what the limiting is doing. So it plays for us the difference between our original signal and our new signal. And they've added in this visual mode as well. Here, I'll mute this track, and just so you can see it, we have our classic visualization with meters, and we have this new graphical mode. The graphical mode is pretty cool. It shows the amount of limiting happening up top. It shows the peak, this dark blue, and the RMS, this light blue. And then if we add in our upward compressor, it shows how much upward compression we're doing there in the bottom. And that also affects the attenuation control here. We can also turn up the amount of clipping we're doing, change the speed of release, etc. So that is that new mode. I'm going to set this back to its factory default, and I'm going to apply a set amount of limiting here. And let's take back the stereo link control, and we'll start to hear this thing in just a sec. So those are the big things that stand out for me as far as new features on this guy. The fact of adding the stereo link is going to make me use this a whole bunch. I used to use the L2 a lot, and I kind of started to shy away from it, mostly because it didn't have the stereo link control. I also love that they've put in the mode selector. I think that's a must for any modern limiter. And I like that they put in this upward compressor. Different tone. Some people think it's more transparent. I don't know. I think it just sounds different, upward compression versus downward limiting. They've added in this new graphical mode, the delta listen, and the gain match, and as well as the clipping function. Oh, and I should mention a loudness meter here. This is something that was not on the original L2. And again, I think this is essential on every limiter today. Every limiter should have some type of LUFS metering, and we have that here. Great. So those are the features, those are the principles. Now let's hear it in action, and let's do a little bit of tasting along with me. I just had a members only mix feedback session just yesterday in our members only platform, which, by the way, you can check out if you want. If you want to become a member, you can go over to members.sonicscoop.com, sign up for the SonicScoop Audio Accelerator, and we do monthly mixed feedback sessions where a whole bunch of people will send in tracks across a wide variety of genres. We listen to reference tracks together, remind ourselves what great music sounds like in that genre, and then listen to your mixes and see where they're living up to their potential and where they're not, what your lowest hanging fruit is for what you can improve. And I've selected just a few tracks from some of my mix coaching and member clients in here, and we'll hear these limiters on a few tracks I've selected. I think I've got a few genres here. I've got, let's see, kind of metal track from a band called Born of Adam. I've got a hip hop track from an artist called Mike P. And I've got kind of a pop punk track from an artist called Dit. So big thanks to those guys for sending in tracks. And we'll hear this on a variety of genres. Let me know in the comments or in the chat if there's particular genres you want to hear me do more demos on. As a mastering guy and as a coaching guy, I get stuff from across genres. I get, EDM, electronic, hip hop, Latin, jazz, rock, metal, all over the place. But I have a little bit of smattering of genres here for you today, so we can hear this thing in action and hear it compared to other limiters. So let's start with this track. I've got one called Scarred by the Animals from the band Born of Adam. Thank you very much for Peter Jordan for sending this one in. I think he's one of the songwriters here and performers, and he self-produced this and mixed this, and he's been a mix coaching client and a mastering client. And let's take this track, which is a pretty decent sounding, fairly accessible metal track. And I wanted to lead with some metal and rock and hip hop stuff because these are genres that can take often substantial amounts of limiting and sometimes demand substantial amounts of limiting. And I want to push this limiter kind of hard to see what it sounds like when we're doing significant amounts of limiting. So let's do a quick before and after. Hear this along with me. Here's our original up here, and this one labeled L4 has about 5 dB of L4 limiting being applied. There's also a little bit of mastering EQ curve that I don't have up on the screen right now. It's hidden in the other inserts because I just want to focus on the limiter, but we'll hear a little bit of that in the before and after, and then we'll focus mostly on turning this limiter on and off and comparing it to other limiters of this style. So just as a quick thing, here's what the mix sounded like originally. And now here it is limited with some EQ. So you can see we're at about 7 to 8 LUFs here, which is not the loudest that records go in this style, but it was a similar loudness setting to a lot of artists in his genre. Like the kinds of artists he liked in his genre were around this target, around 7 to 8. And this is one of these things where a little bit of limiting is addressing some of the deficiencies in the mix by taking some of the excessive transients on the side and just toning those down. It's having a slightly fattening effect, but also some of that is from a slight EQ curve that I have. But we could say, take this in slightly different directions. I find that this modern mode has just a slightly bit more bite than some of the other limiters I was trying. So I want to go into the smooth mode and see if that fattens things up even a little bit more. Let's hear it now in the smooth mode. And that to me is rounding things out and just adding a little bit of heft. If you feel like you're losing a little bit of detail, then I think going back to either this modern mode or the aggressive mode is just adding a tiny bit of bite to it. I did, I think, a couple of little tweaks here, and here's an adjusted version where I set the release really fast, I put it in smooth mode, and then I set the clip really high to hear what that would sound like. And let's do a quick comparison. These differences are going to be subtle, but when I play L4, this will be the modern mode. And when I play L4 adjusted, this will be the smooth mode. You know what, let me turn the stereo link off on this guy, so there'll be a slight more of a difference. So here's the L4, and here's an adjusted version of the L4. Let's hear that. So these are subtle differences. And if you're listening on an iPhone right now, you might not even hear some of the differences I'm talking about. But this is just an ever so slightly kind of widening and fattening to me on the adjusted version of this. Now, we could compare this L4 to the original L2, and does it actually sound different? I think yes. And particularly when we're doing this amount of limiting, I'm doing 4 to 5 dB of limiting, so this is substantial. But whether or not you can hear this depends a little bit on how deeply you're listening and how good your system is. So let's hear a little bit of this L4, and then I'll compare it to the L2 and the L1. Let me bring both these guys up on screen. Here's Wave's original L2. And now here is their super old school L1. And let's hear these sections back to back against each other. Now, one of the best things that you can do is hear this on your own genres, on your own records. But hopefully these examples will be at least a little bit illustrative for you. So here we go. I'm going to solo the L4 up here, and then the L2 and the L1 down here. All right, first, L4. To me, there's just something a little bit blockier and duller sounding about the L2. I actually like the sound as well. It's just a little bit thicker, but maybe a little bit more veiled in the transients. And I think we can get a little closer to it by going to the smooth mode in this L4. And just ever so slightly, even in the smooth mode, the L4 just opens up the track for me a little bit. I'm just hearing a tiny bit more width out of it, and just a tiny bit more openness and a tiny bit more back to front with basically the same settings. We can also enable another feature I forgot to tell you about that's in the L4 is they've put in oversampling, which is also potentially useful. Oh, and there's also a true peak mode in it. This is something else. When I was going over the features, I should have mentioned the L2 Ultra Maximizer does not have a true peak mode. So you're usually going to have to turn down your output ceiling a little bit to avoid oversample peaks if you want to get a really loud master. So to have a true peak limiter really allows you to use kind of all of the level that is possible. You're not going to have to turn down your output ceiling substantially. Sometimes if you want to go for a super hot sounding master, you might have to turn down your output ceiling on something like a conventional L2 by half a dB, 3/4 of a dB, a full dB to avoid oversample peaks. But just by putting in a good sounding true peak meter, and that's a mode that's available here, you can now set your output ceiling theoretically to 0 and not have to deal with intersample peaks, which can potentially cause distortion, particularly when it's being converted to streaming formats. So hopefully you could hear that difference. I think the even bigger difference here is when I'm in modern mode. And then let's compare this L4 to the original L1. It's a little more open. And now the L1. And for me, it's a subtle difference, but the L1 really does sound smaller and more distorted at the same loudness. Tell me if you can hear that happening. Here's our L1, and then I'll flip back to our L4. It just opens up a little bit and widens out a little bit, and I'm hearing a little bit less harmonic distortion. I'm playing these kind of quick sip tests, but my biggest recommendation here is to download a few limiters for yourself. I think some of the biggest differences you're going to hear are between, say, the smooth and safe mode in the L4, say, compared to the original L1, and that could be a good test for you to do on uncompressed, unlimited material that you're familiar with to hear how your tracks respond to it. Some kind of other cool limiters that Waves have had in the past. There's also the L3. In listening to these, I got to say, I think I like the L2 raw sound more than the L3, which to me felt just a little bit murkier. But they have another limiter that is really great. They should definitely try one of these days if you haven't already, the L3 Multi. And the L3 Multi is basically a multiband limiter. And this one should have a more substantial tone. Here, I'll play the L3 Multi with and without the limiting, and just hear the change in tone as it dips down our low mids and a tiny bit of our upper mids. So here's the L3 before. That one has a pretty nice tightening effect. But out of all of these, I got to say, my favorite thing that I've heard so far is the smooth mode in the L4 for this particular track, and for a bunch of tracks I've tried it on. Every once in a while, I'm finding myself liking the aggressive mode, and then every once in a while, when things need to be just a little bit tighter sounding than the smooth mode, this modern mode is really nice as well. We can hear this on a couple of other genres. I had this track that one of our mixed feedback members sent in. Here's a hip hop track called Zone. The artist I think is Mike P, and the engineer on this one, mixer, is a guy named Benj. It's one of his tracks. And let's hear how this sounds in more of a hip hop genre, both before and after, and then I'll kind of really start to crush things, and then we'll flip through some of the modes to see if you can hear the differences. So the track before, here's the totally uncompressed, uneq'd one. Really nice sounding mix of the beat, but I found it was a little bit brighter and a little bit shinier and glossier sounding than a lot of records in the style. And it actually wanted to be crunched up and mid-ranged up a little bit. So I added just a little bit of an EQ that brings forward the mid-range and adds a little bit of saturation to the low end. So here's our original.
I've just awoken. I wish I could hold that dream and keep it frozen, so my eyes, I close them. Take a sec to go in and recollect those moments. Yawn, stretch, shed it like dry skin. Remember who I am, might be no hyphen.
So definitely sounding good, but honestly a little bit pretty for the genre. It needs to get crunked up a little bit more. And some of the transients are poking out a little bit on those vocals on the sides. And just adding a little bit of limiting, stereo unlinked, smooth some of that stuff out a little bit. Here it is, post some EQ and limiting.
Zoning. I've just awoken. I wish I could hold that dream and keep it frozen, so my eyes, I close them. Take a sec to go in and recollect those moments. Yawn, stretch, shed it like dry skin.
So getting crunked up just a little bit. And now let's hear how far we can push this limiter before it really starts to sound bad. Let's go.
Yawn, stretch, shed it like dry skin. Remember who I am, might be no hyphen. Back to reality, wipe my face, full clarity. Carpe diem status, straight away, sip coffee, chill. Shower and shave, pull myself together, cause this is how to behave. Now in my younger years, I thought of going out in the blaze, but nowadays, I take it day by day. I'm just playing, y'all, I'm okay. And by the way, not to go out of my way, but we all gotta find a way until our final day. I'm up and out the door, I gotta get paid, and I gotta buy time for a holiday.
So for me on this one, I think it still sounds pretty good when we're getting into the 3 and 4 threshold. When we got here around 7 and 8, it's starting to get a little bit too crunked up, but adding just a little bit of crunk, definitely useful. Here, we can hear it on one more track and one more genre. A guy named Aaron Smith submitted this one for a band called Dit. This is kind of more of a pop punk thing. Let's hear the original unmastered one. It's a track called Good As It Gets. Let's hear a little bit of this. Totally different style, right? Here's the unmastered pop punk track.
I got mine. Feels like I'm standing on a landmine, and all the things that I said feels like that I'm better off dead. Get up, get out. No clue what you're talking about, cause I can't tell you what I'm thinking. Is this?
It sounds pretty good, but I feel like the vocal is a little bit on top of the mix, and I feel like things could fatten out just a little bit. So let's hear it with a tiny bit of EQ curve and a little bit of limiting applied, and then we'll turn on and off the limiter and see how loud we can push it.
Well, I got mine. Feels like I'm standing on a landmine, and all the things that I said feels like that I'm better off dead. Get up, get out. No clue what you're talking about, cause I can't tell you what I'm thinking. Is this as good as it gets? Constant blaming, constant complaining. Is this as good as it gets?
So I'm doing just a tiny bit of EQ fattening there as well, which we're not exploring. But the biggest thing for me is getting a little bit more of this level and heft and kind of transient control. And it evens out the balance of the vocal a little bit. And just since the vocal is poking out above everything else, it limits down the vocal just a hair and kind of brings up the rest of the band around it. So sometimes applying a little bit of limiting can make things sound more impressive rather than less impressive. And of course, if you go too far with it, it goes the other way. All right, those are my thoughts on limiters. That is what is new about the Waves 4 Ultra Maximizer. Quick review there is the addition of the LUFS metering, the mode controls. We've got this clip function, the stereo link function, which has been added, and this upward compression, which has been added. Oh, and it looks like on this pass, I was applying a little bit of upward compression to this kind of pop punk track. I think you should go ahead, and I've made this long enough. I don't want to compare between the regular limiting and the upward compression here on this. I'm going to say go to waves.com, download this, and compare what it sounds like when you turn upward compression all the way up and turn your threshold off, and compare that to getting the same amount of attenuation the opposite way by turning your threshold down and leaving the upward compression off. It is a somewhat substantial difference in tone. And I've found that I've really been liking adding in just a little bit of this, somewhere around 2.5 down to 0. Somewhere in this range has been pretty sweet. But every once in a while, backing off on this threshold and just cranking the upward compressor has given me tones that I'm not used to getting out of limiters. And it's definitely something that's worth exploring. I'm going to take a moment to look at your comments here and your questions to see if any came in during the live stream. Johan Ansir from Tullamore Studio says, I use and like the L4. Belgium here. Great. The Morning I Woke Up Dead is the name of a user. Says, hello, Justin, and hello, chat. Well, hello, The Morning I Woke Up Dead. What a pleasant name, especially appropriate since we are going to Halloween tomorrow. Happy Halloween to everybody. Higher Ground says, I've only ever used the L1 and the L2 so far. The L1 is a really popular limiter for using on individual elements. It's not one of my most common ones that I'll use on mixed bus, but it is a little bit dirtier and a little bit more kind of fattening and grainifying than the L2. And sometimes that is super useful on individual tracks. It's less transparent than the L2, let's say, and way less transparent than the L4. But sometimes that's exactly what you want for an individual track basis. Like I said, not my top pick for the mix bus, but definitely a top pick for submixes and individual instruments. Don't sleep on the L1. Let's see. DJ Loopy says, hey, Justin, made it on time. Glad to have you here. Phase Station, good to have you. Bernardo Ray says, man, no sandwich question last session. Oh, did I forget to ask Prizzy his favorite sandwich? No, that is not true at all. I asked Prizzy what his favorite sandwich was. You apparently did not stay for the whole live stream, but it was 100% asked, and it was asked relatively early on. So shame on you, Bernardo, for not listening to the entire session. Bernardo has been here for every one of our MixCon sessions, I think for the past couple of years, and he has asked every single MixCon presenter what their favorite sandwich is. He has never, however, as far as I can remember, asked me my favorite sandwich. So I'm kind of disappointed. Body of Play says, Ozone Vintage Limiter is the king. I don't know. Ozone Vintage Limiter is a good one. It is not my preferred Ozone limiter. I like the Ozone limiter, and I often use its IRC1 mode for when I'm doing very little limiting. I think it sounds fat and smooth, but the IRC1 mode cannot handle lots of limiting before it breaks up. I sometimes use their IRC2 mode, which is very tight and very bright sounding for me. And sometimes when something is too fat, too dark, too dull, and you want a brighter, tighter, more aggressive sounding limiter, the IRC2 mode in the Ozone Ultra Maximizer is a great one. And then when I want to do a lot of limiting, I'll often use the IRC4 mode in the Ozone limiter. But for modern styles of music production, I don't find that the vintage limiter is one that I often go to in a mastering context. That said, this might be different on an individual track basis context. I think where the vintage limiter from Ozone really shines is on individual tracks, which is a place where I think the L1 from Waves really shines. So those would be some of my top picks for individual tracks, the L1 from Waves and the vintage limiter, which is very different from Isotope. For the actual like mix bus and mastering context, I would say the IRC 1, 2, and 4 from Isotope are all good. But I would compare the modern mode in this new Waves L4 to the IRC4 in the Ozone Maximizer. And I think that the modern mode in the Waves L4 sounds just a little bit, maybe a little bit brighter, tighter, possibly, than the L4. I want to do more back-to-back comparisons, and I'm really liking the smooth mode in the L4. Excuse me. Mr. Jan says, I love the Weiss limiter. What else is similar? You know, I haven't played around with the Weiss limiter much. I definitely should. San Sonara says, hello, Justin, everyone. The book from Bob Katz is called Mastering Audio, The Art and the Science by Robert A. Katz. All right. Thank you for that. San Sonara says, smooth mode sounds fuller, punchier, richer, closer, and wider. Yeah, so far on much of the material I've been going through, I've been really gravitating towards the smooth mode and occasionally towards the modern mode. Schligny says, much more distorted. When we add limiting, we add distortion. I didn't play the safe mode where we're going to have less distortion. But when you get less distortion out of a limiter, you're often getting more pumping and breathing artifacts. But yes, you are not going to do 4 dB of limiting without introducing some distortion. That's just the way that it is. But that said, one of the biggest problems with modern music, since we've gotten to the digital age, is lack of distortion. I mean, analog devices, why people love them is because they add distortion. And limiters are one way of adding some distortion if they are super fast limiters doing a lot of it. Costa says, compare it to Oxford, please. I'm not doing comparisons this time. I'm just comparing against the other Waves ones, but in a session where that isn't sponsored by any one particular plugin company, then maybe I will compare them all to each other. But I don't know. I think that'll be a super nerdy session. Do you think you guys are ready for me to compare like every limiter to one another on a live stream, because those differences are going to be so subtle. And I think the best way to hear them is really to compare them for yourself on your own source material. Go to waves.com, download their L4 free trial, go to all these other companies' websites, download their free trials, and make these comparisons for yourself and start to develop a sense memory for how they sound compared to one another. Higher Ground says, I like the L1 on bass drum for that exact reason. It adds some artifacts that help the click come through. Yeah, there's something about the distortion that the L1 adds that is great for, I find, kick, bass, and vocals. That the L1 adds this harmonic distortion, particularly on bass elements, that help them cut through in the mix a little bit better. Like, it takes down the low end on your kick or your bass, which is great because often kicks and basses have too much low end that swamp your mix. And one of the biggest problems where the low end suffers on a lot of beginner mixer stuff is they just have way too much low end, like sub stuff on their kick and bass that they can't even hear on their system. And once you take that stuff down and you add some mid-range and you add some saturated mid-range to a kick or bass, and then you just turn up the level of the kick or bass, now you have a kick and bass that really speaks across a wide variety of systems, like your unlimited, untreated kick and bass aren't doing. Johan is backing me up, saying, yes, Prizzy's favorite sandwich was grilled cheese. Yeah, so shame on you, Bernardo, for asking the question and not hanging out. Tanner writes in to say grilled cheese too. Yeah, so see, all these people remembered except for you, Bernardo. You're the guy who asked, and you don't remember. Okay, great. San Sonera says, no sandwich question for you. Okay, no one will get to know my favorite sandwich. The secret will die with me. Brian Summers says, I love the Pulsar API 25 limiter function. Yeah, an analog limiter, totally different vibe than something like the L2, L4, and some of the other limiters we've talked about. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name. Sieglind says, no love here for limiters like the IK Multimedia Stealth Limiter or Signum Audio, these very clean beasts. I haven't played around with those too much myself. There is a very clean mode in this Waves L4, and that would be the safe mode. But again, that's not the kind of limiting we often hear on major releases. And sometimes I find that cleaner limiters, I can hear them working more than a limiter that allows itself to be a little bit dirtier. There is a trade-off between higher harmonic distortion and greater amounts of amplitude fluctuation from the limiter. So that's something to think about. Just because a limiter is cleaner, meaning less harmonic distortion, doesn't necessarily mean it's less audible. It might be more audible. All right, let's continue. San says, we love the knowledge and wisdom you generously give. So yes. All right, does that mean you want to know my favorite sandwich? I don't know. Costa says, definitely did some comparisons by myself. And Tanner says, Justin, I sent you a long extended email about speakers. Oh, I'll have to check it out. Tanner, I'm having trouble staying on top of emails this week and pretty much every XCon week because I'm just overloaded with still having to do mastering while producing the MixCon stuff and overseeing edits and shoots and all that. But I will look for your email, Tanner. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that some of this was useful, that you learned something about how to apply limiters, what to think about when choosing them, and hopefully you started to learn how to listen to limiters, and maybe you heard some subtle differences here. I want to hear from you in the chat and in the comments. What limiter modes here were your favorites? What limiters are your favorites? If you've tried this, how you feel it compares to other limiters, and what are your favorite modes and favorite features in the new L4? Thank you guys so much for joining. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Oh, reminder, I just want to say one last time that you can, in fact, go over to mix-con.com, that's mix-con.com, and sign up for more masterclasses coming up. We've had a whole bunch of great ones this year, and we have more coming up. We got one with Nico Bolas, who has worked a whole bunch with Neil Young, Prince, Buffalo Springfield, whole bunch of classic artists. He has been working on major records since the 70s, and now he's working on forward-looking records in Atmos. He's coming up next week. We have a whole bunch of great workshops. You got to check out the presentation with Prizzy if you haven't. Another really popular one this year has been with Andrew Sheps. We had an alt-country track from Brent Colatalo. Really cool kind of alt-rock like indie pop track from Dana Nielsen that was just beautiful sounding from the artist Mount Joy. I can't recommend these enough. And remember that when you go over here, you can click on the giveaway button, and we have 3 chances to win more than $10,000 worth of free gear from all the MixCon sponsors, including Waves, who are giving away the Waves Ultimate Bundle. So you absolutely have to check that out. Go over to mix-con.com. Big shout out and thanks to Waves and all the MixCon sponsors for making this stuff free to the public. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.